I deleted the moon, and Earth immediately started to go crazy. Not in 1,000 years, not in 1,000,000, but right now. And the further it went, the faster everything spiraled out of control. Today, you will see what happens to our planet if the moon disappears. And frankly, the consequences turned out to be far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The first minutes and hours without the moon. In the very first minute after the moon disappears, a strange silence falls. The sea behaves as if someone hit pause. Those huge tidal waves that Earth was used to suddenly shrink by almost several times. A person on the beach might not even immediately realize that something has changed, but animals will sense it instantly. Nocturnal predators will lose their landmarks. Sea turtles will look up to the sky and not see their eternal navigator. And birds will start flying chaotically, as if someone switched off their internal compass. The night becomes noticeably darker. At first, a person thinks their eyes just haven't adjusted, but gradually the realization comes. There really is less light. The moon, even when it looks like a small gray shard, illuminates the planet more than most people think. Now the darkness presses down, becoming dense, almost material. But the strangest thing is happening not on the surface. Earth itself feels the absence of the moon. The tilt of the axis, which is usually held almost motionless, trembles slightly, as if the planet is trying to keep its balance, but has lost its familiar support. This tremor doesn't show on the outside, but inside Earth, an invisible process begins that will very soon turn into chaos. Just a few hours pass. The temperature in some regions shifts barely perceptibly. The night drags on a little longer than usual, but humans don't realize this yet. People look into the sky, trying to find the crescent, and for the first time in the entire history of civilization, they cannot understand what exactly is causing this anxiety inside. But the anxiety is justified. Everything that happened in these first hours was just the introduction. It was only a quiet whisper before the real storm begins, and very soon Earth will feel the absence of the moon much more strongly, and the consequences will turn out to be so rapid and destructive that humanity won't even have time to realize the scale of what is happening. The first weirdness. Imagine, just one day passes after the moon disappears, and at first it seems like nothing terrible has happened. The sky has become a bit emptier, the nights a bit darker. So what? People go outside, cities shine with lights, oceans are calm. But this calmness is just a thin film that is about to crack. After a few hours, the first anomalous data starts coming in from ocean stations. The sea level, which should have risen and fallen according to the usual tidal schedule, suddenly freezes. Tides don't just get weaker, they practically disappear. Where the water used to rise by 2 meters, now it ripples by some pathetic tens of centimeters. Scientists immediately realize the disappearance of the moon's gravity breaks one of the planet's most important rhythms. But it's not just about the water. Because of the disappearance of lunar tides, air movements begin to change. The wind shifts barely perceptibly, and this causes a domino effect. In some regions, the temperature at night drops noticeably below normal, and in others, on the contrary, it becomes anomalously warmer. People feel this, but no one understands the scale yet. Then, strange things start happening with animals. Sea turtles, which for centuries laid eggs guided by moonlight, veer off course and come ashore in the wrong places. Birds migrating through the night sky lose an important landmark. They fly lower, get lost in cities more often, crash into buildings, stray from routes. Even many insects lose their usual rhythm because the lunar cycle was their internal calendar. Scientists sound the alarm. Ecosystems begin to feel the absence of the satellite earlier than humans. And then begins what cannot be hidden by any news. The nights become too dark. People go out into the streets and look up, expecting to see the familiar bright disk. But there is emptiness, just a huge little void, as if someone cut a round hole in the sky. And this darkness presses down, as if reminding, this is just the beginning. The first alarming messages appear in the news. Astronomers record acceleration of Earth's axis drift. Oceanologists warn of tidal balance disruption. Ecologists report sharp change in animal behavior. And the more time passes, the clearer it becomes. Life on Earth has begun to quietly, slowly, but inexorably go crazy. The first week of chaos. Just a few days pass, and Earth begins to change more noticeably. What seemed like a slight tremor in the first hours turns into real instability. The tilt of the Earth's axis, which usually remains almost unchanged, begins to shift slowly but perceptibly. For an ordinary person, this is not a disaster yet, but for the climate, it is a blow that triggers a chain reaction. The weather becomes unpredictable. Where calm, warm nights usually stood, sudden gusts of cold wind appear. In regions where it rarely rains, prolonged dampness begins. All this looks like strange anomalies, but they are not accidental. Earth is trying to keep its balance without the one who always helped it stay stable. Animals continue to suffer the most. Birds used to navigating by moonlight begin to migrate in the wrong directions. Many species stray from routes, lose instincts, encounter predators, or die from exhaustion. Nocturnal insects, which lived under a specific rhythm of light for millennia, disappear from familiar places, and this hits the food chain. And people begin to notice more alarming signs. Tides behave strangely. In some areas, the water recedes too far, exposing the seabed like never before. In other places, on the contrary, the agitated sea rises above the norm, as if someone is pulling it by an invisible thread. Coastal tide clocks fail. Fishermen realize that nothing happens on time anymore. But the most disturbing thing is the night sky. Scientific observatories record a small but constant shift in the position of stars relative to the horizon. Some constellations seem to rise slightly higher, others lower. This is not an optical illusion. This is Earth beginning to change its position in space, albeit quite insignificantly for now. And the most dangerous thing is that this process cannot be stopped. It has only just begun. The first week without the moon is not chaos, it is just a warning. And very soon, it will become clear that the first week was still the quietest. Real problems begin later, when Earth stops simply adjusting and starts breaking. Beginning of climate chaos. Several weeks pass. Everything that previously seemed like minor oddities adds up to a single alarming picture. Earth no longer rotates as before. For billions of years, the moon acted as a giant brake, restraining our rotation and keeping the axis within reasonable limits. Now, this brake is gone, and the planet starts behaving like a car whose brakes suddenly failed on a descent. Astronomical stations around the world record, the tilt of the Earth's axis oscillates more strongly than usual. This is not an instant disaster in the style of movies where the planet flips over in 10 minutes. This is different. It is a gradual loosening, a slow shift of balance. But it is precisely such processes that are the most dangerous because they accumulate. And the first thing people notice is the weather. Familiar climate zones begin to shift. Where there used to be mild winters, heat suddenly sets in for several weeks. In other regions, summer turns into an endless series of cold winds and rains. Meteorologists rack their brains. Old models no longer work. Algorithms that predicted weather 7 days ahead begin to make mistakes after just a few hours. Nature seems to have stopped obeying the rules. And then, the first truly major anomalies occur. Huge air masses change trajectories. Tropical cyclones intensify and begin to appear in zones where they couldn't be before. Too cold, too unstable, too high in latitudes. One such storm reaches the coast of Europe, causing floods where they never happened at this time of year. People begin to understand that these are not isolated events, but a new rhythm of the planet. The Atlantic experiences its own shock. Global ocean circulation, dependent on water temperature and salinity, begins to disrupt. Currents shift, slow down, sometimes even stop for several days. Fishermen notice that familiar fish migration routes have disappeared. Huge schools of mackerel and tuna go in unknown directions, and ecosystems built on these movements begin to fall apart. Meanwhile, in the Arctic and Antarctic, ice melts in some places and unexpectedly grows in others, where severe frosts suddenly return due to jumps in air masses. No model can predict these fluctuations. Scientists admit, Earth has entered an era of climate chaos. People also feel the consequences. In cities, power outages happen now and then. Power grids cannot withstand sharp temperature jumps. Crops die from unpredictable droughts or sudden frosts. Farmers lose their bearings. The lunar calendar was not just a tradition, but part of a delicate ecosystem balance formed over millennia. And the scariest thing is the understanding that all this is just the early consequences. Even without the moon, Earth has not yet had time to fully rebuild. We see only the first waves of changes, the first cracks of a huge system that always seemed eternal and stable. But soon, the next shock comes. With each month continues what scientists call axis drift. This is a slow, almost imperceptible shift, which over time will lead to the change of seasons ceasing to be what we are used to knowing. And then, humanity begins to ask a question that previously sounded only in disaster movies. What will happen to Earth if this drift continues? 1 to 10 years after the moon disappears. Just a few years pass, and the changes become so obvious that it is impossible to deny what is happening. What looked like slight climate fluctuations in the first days now turns into a steady, ever-increasing chaos. The Earth's axis continues to slowly shift, and each new degree of deviation triggers new chains of changes. Seasons begin to behave strangely. Winter comes not when it is expected, and summer lasts longer or shorter than usual. In some countries, unprecedented cold unexpectedly strikes. In others, heat suddenly covers, which was previously considered impossible. The geographic map of the climate begins to be redrawn right before our eyes. In these years, the first major disasters appear. Tropical storms become more frequent and powerful than before. They flare up in regions where they never arose before. Where people lived in relative calm for centuries, destructive hurricanes now occur. The sea, deprived of the lunar rhythm, becomes more aggressive. In the absence of normal high and low tides, water masses move chaotically, causing new zones of constant flooding to appear. Agriculture suffers almost immediately. Harvests fail one after another. Plants don't understand when their usual seasons arrive and die en masse. Some regions receive too much moisture, others, almost nothing. Old climate maps that farmers guided themselves by become useless. People have to invent new ways of growing food, but even the most modern technologies do not always save. Cities that were previously considered safe now suffer from constant temperature swings. In the same country, one part of the population suffers from unprecedented heat, the other from prolonged cold. Infrastructure cannot keep up with adapting. Power grids work at the limit. Cooling and heating systems fail. Scientific institutes record increasingly strange phenomena. Observing the sky, astronomers notice that some stars already rise above the horizon at a different angle, and familiar astronomical coordinates no longer work. Earth behaves like an unbalanced spinning top, slowly losing stability. Smart words and complex graphs no longer help. Scientists admit for the first time, the planet is entering a phase of deep climate changes. And all this is just the beginning of decades of chaos. The tilt of the axis continues to drift. Seasons are completely thrown off. Everything that previously seemed fundamental and unchanging begins to turn into a shaky, unstable state. People, animals, ecosystems, everything feels that an era has arrived when familiar natural laws no longer operate as before. But the scariest thing is the understanding that Earth has not yet reached the point where changes become truly irreversible. Ahead lie years and centuries that will be far more destructive. What is happening now is merely the prelude to much deeper, crueler, and more frightening transformations. How it will hit people. Several decades after the disappearance of the Moon, humanity finds itself in a completely new reality. People who lived at the beginning of these changes still remember the old Earth, stable seasons, predictable weather, calm sea. But the new generation already perceives chaos as the norm, unsuspecting that once the planet was quiet, even, and predictable. Agriculture continues to collapse. Where grain used to be grown, now lie either scorched plains or cold swamps. Regions that gave stable harvests for thousands of years cease to feed the population. Plants don't understand when to grow, when to bloom, when to shed leaves. Their biological clocks are broken just like the rhythm of the planet itself. Where winters unexpectedly become warmer, insects begin to multiply in huge numbers. Some species flood new territories, others disappear completely. The disruption of these delicate balances leads to pests destroying crops so quickly that fighting them becomes almost impossible. Many countries face food shortages. City life also ceases to be the same. In metropolises on the coasts, water begins to approach residential areas. In the absence of lunar tides, the sea now rises and falls according to other, much more unpredictable patterns. Sometimes it freezes almost motionless. Sometimes it rises so high that it floods entire districts. People have to build dams, try to erect new engineering systems, but they are practically useless. No one knows how the water will behave tomorrow or in a week. Climate instability causes a wave of diseases. Outbreaks of infections occur in places where they were never expected. Disease-carrying insects migrate to new climatic zones, and people do not have time to adapt to the changed biology of the surrounding world. Alternating waves of heat and cold led to an increase in cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. Against the background of all these changes, society becomes anxious and tense. People feel that the ground under their feet has literally ceased to be what it was before. Previous knowledge about the climate no longer works. Weather forecasts based on thousands of years of observations lose meaning. Scientists try to find new patterns, but any forecast, any assumption turns into an error after a few months. But even this is not the hardest thing for humanity. The real blow comes from an unexpected side. The source of chaos becomes not only the climate, but the rhythm of life itself. Earth, gradually losing lunar braking, begins to change its rotation speed. And this affects every person without exception. The length of the day begins to change. At first, quite imperceptibly, by fractions of a second. Then by a second. Then by minutes. People notice that the body begins to behave strangely. Sleep becomes less or more. Fatigue comes faster. Vigor lasts less. Internal clocks, which synchronized with the 24-hour cycle for millions of years, begin to malfunction. And the further it goes, the worse. The world is gradually entering an era when a person has to live in conditions for which he was not created. The body suffers. The economy suffers. Entire countries cease to function as before. But all this is just preparation for much larger-scale events. Earth is just starting to accelerate in the direction that will completely change its appearance in the future. And the real turning point will happen when the planet's rotation truly ceases to be what we know it to be. When the axis begins to slip away. Months pass. People have adapted to the strange weather, to the disrupted tides, to the darkness without moonlight. But all this is just surface symptoms. Real changes are happening deep inside the planet itself. It is then that what scientists previously discussed only in theoretical articles begins to manifest. Earth is gradually losing the stability of its axis tilt. Before, the moon held our axis like a giant anchor. Thanks to it, Earth's tilt remained almost unchanged, about 23.5 degrees. This angle created the gentle change of seasons, allowing life to develop as we know it. But now, this anchor is gone, and the axis begins to wander. Not in jerks, not in dramatic leaps, but in a slow, cold, ruthless slide. Every month, fractions of a degree. Every fraction, climate changes on whole continents. At first, what happens seems somewhat non-standard but still tolerable. Summer in some countries becomes noticeably longer and winter shorter. Where snow used to lie until March, it now disappears as early as February. On the other end of the planet, on the contrary, winter unexpectedly drags on, and summer heat is late. But after a while it becomes clear. The climate is not just changing, it is rebuilding. It is trying to adjust to the new position of the planet in space. In countries closer to the equator, the heat intensifies so that humidity turns life into an endless sauna. Nights, which used to bring relief, now hardly cool the air. People evacuate en masse from coastal tropics. The UN creates commissions for the resettlement of climate refugees, the first signal that the world has entered a new era. In northern regions, frosts, on the contrary, become increasingly severe. But not because Earth is cooling, but because the angle of the axis tilt shifts so that sunlight falls differently. Somewhere in Canada, the temperature drops to record values. In Siberia, parts of regions are covered by polar night for several weeks, although this never happened before. People see darkness that does not leave even during the day. It is terrifying to the bone. But worst of all is that all this is just an intermediate stage. The axis continues to move. And scientists warn, if the drift does not stop, Earth may find itself in one of two scenarios. First, the planet will start striving for a more vertical position. Then the change of seasons will almost disappear. Imagine a world where summer lasts almost all year round in some regions, and in others, endless cold grayness. Harvests will perish, ecosystems collapse, billions of people will end up in zones unsuitable for life. The second scenario is even worse. The axis may tilt more, much more, up to 40 degrees, up to 50, even up to 60. If this happens, every country on Earth will experience climate roller coasters that will be impossible to predict. Winter may come in August, summer, in December. Ice will melt where it should grow, and deserts will begin to appear in places where it has been humid and cool for thousands of years. And all this is just a consequence of the absence of the moon. Then the most alarming thing begins. Scientists record that the axis oscillations are accelerating. There is no longer a lunar force that smoothed out these movements, and the drift turns from a slow process into a dangerously fast one. The world freezes. What if Earth really starts to flip over? When Earth loses balance. The moment comes when scientists stop using cautious wording. In scientific publications, in briefings, in interviews, they no longer say possibly, probably, presumably. Now other words are heard: inevitable, irreversible, accelerating. The Earth's axis continues to move away from its usual position, and this begins to reflect not only on the climate, but on the very structure of day and night. People notice for the first time that the length of the day has changed slightly. Not dramatically, not by hours, but enough for atomic clocks, the most precise instruments ever created by mankind, to record it. When a day increases by just a few minutes, no one feels anything. But these minutes accumulate. A week, and the day becomes a little longer. A month, and the difference begins to be felt biologically. A year, and the world turns upside down. Living organisms on Earth depend on the rhythm of light and darkness much more than it seems. Human sleep is disturbed. Animal activity cycles go astray. Plants, accustomed to a certain day length, have difficulty determining when to bloom, when to shed leaves, when to grow shoots. Half of agriculture begins to collapse even before catastrophic climate changes, just because biology stops understanding time. But then, what becomes a real turning point happens. For the first time in the entire history of mankind, a headline appears in the media. Scientists recorded the beginning of large-scale precession without stabilization. Precession is that very wobbling movement of Earth that the Moon always helped restrain. Now, nothing holds it back, and the planet begins to slightly tip over on its side. In Africa, the tropics become unbearably hot, turning into a giant zone of thermal hell. In Europe, summer unexpectedly shifts to spring, and autumn comes earlier than usual. In South America, rainforests begin to dry out and die. Australia turns into a territory of endless storms because cyclones now form chaotically, without the usual barriers. And all this happens simultaneously. Journalists ask, why right now? And the answer causes cold silence. The Moon has always been a stabilizer. It held Earth in a position convenient for life. Without it, the planet enters a natural but destructive state for us. But this is only part of the trouble. More unexpected things begin to happen. Earth's electromagnetic field, whose stability is closely linked to the planet's rotation, is also affected. It begins to weaken slightly, although previously it was practically unchanged. For now, this is not dangerous, but scientists understand. If the process accelerates, the surface of Earth will become vulnerable to solar wind and cosmic radiation. At this time, mass failures in the animal world begin to occur in different countries. Bird migrations collapse completely. Whales swim too close to the coast and beach themselves en masse. After all, they used to navigate by a complex system where the lunar cycle was an important component. In some places, insects begin to multiply chaotically, creating population outbreaks that are impossible to control. Ecosystems are bursting at the seams. People feel more and more strongly that Earth has lost its balance. And for the first time, serious talk begins that humanity itself could become the cause of the final collapse, unable to withstand the new conditions. But then comes the main question that cannot be avoided. If Earth's axis continues to tilt, how far can this process go? And what exactly will happen to the planet and life on it if the tilt reaches a critical point? Critical tilt point. The moment comes when the Earth's axis tilt reaches a value that previously existed only in computer simulation models. Scientists warned for years that if the angle began to grow rapidly, the consequences would become irreversible. But no one thought that humanity would see this in their lifetime. Now it is not a theory. It is a reality into which we are gradually falling. When the axis tilt reaches about 30 degrees, what happens is something that neither our parents, nor their ancestors, nor any person in the entire history of civilization has felt. Continents begin to be illuminated by the sun at angles that change the habitual course of the seasons. Summer turns into a season of extreme heat, when on half the planet, the temperature rises above what is permissible even for resilient organisms. In some regions, daylight lasts almost a day, and night comes literally for a few hours. This is not enough to cool the earth and air. Infrastructure melts. Asphalt in cities begins to flow down the streets. Power plants work at the limit, but cannot cope with the load. Air conditioners consume so much energy that networks shut down again and again. People hide in underground tunnels, mines, subways, anything where there is at least some coolness left. And everyone understands. This is not temporary. This is the new climate. On the other end of the planet, a dramatically opposite picture. Where it is winter now, a cold sets in that was not seen even during ice ages. And the reason is not global cooling of the planet, but the strange distribution of sunlight. The sun shines at such an angle that its rays glide along the surface, barely warming the air. The temperature drops to values at which even the most modern heating systems fail. Frosts burst pipes, break hydraulic systems, freeze cars in minutes. People find themselves trapped in their own homes because every step outside becomes deadly dangerous. The world splits into two extremes, a zone of fire and a zone of ice. And between these zones runs a narrow strip of temperate climate that jumps across the planet's surface like a drifting border. Cities find themselves in a series of temperature roller coasters. A week of heat, a week of cold, heat again. People lose the ability to plan life even a month ahead. But these are only consequences for the climate. Much scarier is what happens to the biosphere. In heat zones, the soil literally dies. Water evaporates faster than it has time to penetrate deep. Plants whose roots are accustomed to a certain temperature range dry out before seeds have time to form. Agriculture collapses. Mass hunger crises become the main topic of all world news. In the zone of eternal cold, the situation is no better. Forests die from freezing. Rivers turn into giant ice tunnels. Animals migrate, but migrating becomes harder for them. Landmarks, habitual paths, ecosystems that gave food to thousands of species are lost. And amidst this chaos on Earth, a new expression appears that could previously be found only in science fiction: full-phase climate instability. This means that the planet no longer returns to stable equilibrium. It continues to tilt, continues to change, continues to lose predictability. And then specialists ask a question that no one wanted to hear. What will happen if the tilt reaches 40, 50, or even 60 degrees? Will life be able to exist at all at such an angle? And most importantly, is it possible to return the tilt to its previous position if the moon is gone? When the planet starts to flip. And so the moment comes that everyone feared, from climatologists and astronomers to politicians and ordinary people. The axis tilt continues to grow and approaches values at which Earth ceases to be a planet with familiar seasons. It becomes a planet of extremes. And now every change is felt not over thousands of years, as it was before, but within a single human lifetime. When the tilt angle reaches about 40 degrees, the world faces the strangest and most frightening phenomenon. polar regions find themselves much closer to direct sunlight. Imagine Antarctica, bathed in almost vertical light from the sun, which used to only glide along its edge. Ice melts at unimaginable speed. Giant ice sheets that stood for millions of years collapse in years. The world ocean level rises like an avalanche, flooding entire countries. But at the same time, the Arctic doesn't just melt, it becomes a storm zone. Where eternal cold used to reign, giant cyclones now form because cold remnants of ice collide with unusually warm air. These storms, which are impossible to predict, move across the planet, destroying cities. Rivers rise, dams burst, coasts disappear, and tropical regions turn into a desert. Wherever the sun shines too vertically, desertification begins. The rainforests of the Amazon, Congo, and Southeast Asia dry out and turn into huge territories covered with sand and salt crusts. This is not a process for centuries. It is a process for years. When the tilt reaches 50 degrees, the very logic of day and night changes. Countries that lie closer to the new polar zones begin to experience extremely long days and nights, 6, 8, 10 months in a row. Where there used to be a mild winter, now comes months of darkness. The sun does not rise above the horizon, and the temperature drops to values comparable to Mars. People in these regions can live only in specially built dome cities, where artificial lighting and climate control maintain at least some stability. And in opposite regions, endless day. The sun hangs in the sky almost all year round, and the planet warms up to such values that even at night the surface has time to cool only by a few degrees. Deserts expand, soils burn out, lakes dry up. The world ocean becomes warmer than ever in Earth's history, and this leads to a chain of biological disasters that cannot be stopped. Global climate models admit Earth has transitioned into a state that scientists call a quasi-inverted configuration. This means that the planet has actually begun to flip over, not completely, but enough to change the distribution of solar energy beyond recognition. What used to be called poles is now gradually becoming equatorial zones, and vice versa. But the scariest thing is the realization that this process can no longer be stopped. There is no moon to stabilize the axis. There is no force capable of restoring order. Earth strives for a chaotic state that is unsuitable for life. Animals continue to die. Plants disappear. Ecosystems collapse. People survive only on relatively stable patches of the planet, which are becoming smaller. States begin to fight for these territories, and the world rapidly plunges into chaos, which now goes hand in hand with the chaos of nature. And yet, despite this, scientists are trying to find an answer to the main question. Is it possible to create an artificial analog of the moon? Is it possible to return a stabilizer to Earth? But before humanity attempts to do something, it is necessary to understand. What will happen if the axis tilt reaches limit values? If Earth really flips over? The world that flipped over. When the axis tilt reaches approximately 60 degrees, Earth ceases to be the planet humanity knew. It becomes almost unrecognizable. The sun begins to illuminate the surface at such angles that continents receive a completely different share of energy. And then begins what scientists call total climate inversion. This is a state in which the usual logic of climate disappears. Seasons cease to exist. Polar regions become new heat zones. Middle latitudes turn into a kingdom of storms. And former equatorial regions are covered by a year-long night. In the Arctic, where frost used to reign, now there is desert and heat. Huge territories covered with soft snow and ice crust turn into endless, scorching sand. Mountains of ice that stood for centuries melt in a matter of months. Huge masses of water pour into the ocean, raising its level so high that entire states disappear. The Netherlands, Bangladesh, part of Japan, a significant part of the U.S. East Coast. Millions of people are forced to leave their homes, but this is only one side of the disaster. On former equatorial lands, darkness sets in. Real, thick, viscous darkness that lasts not hours, not weeks, but months. The sun appears on the horizon for only a few minutes, failing to warm the air by even 1 degree. The temperature drops so low that the ocean begins to freeze far from the coast. Cities in this zone empty. No one can live in constant night and frost. Plants die, animals disappear, and most of nature simply goes extinct. Between these two seemingly hellish poles is a belt of chaos, a zone stretching across the planet in the form of an uneven ring. There is no stable weather here. Today, there is a hurricane here. Tomorrow, hail the size of a tennis ball. The day after tomorrow, heat. And, in a week, a flood. Lightning strikes so often that it seems like the sky has torn apart. Constant pressure drops create superstorms, atmospheric monsters that wipe cities off the face of the earth. People survive only in specially built shelters. They no longer live in the usual sense. They exist. The system of global civilization is collapsing. Governments unite only trying to maintain control over the remnants of stable territories. The planet's largest scientific centers work around the clock, trying to understand if there is any way to stop this process. But the answer becomes obvious. Earth did not flip completely, but this was enough to destroy the world as we knew it. Without the moon, the axis tilt became unstable, and the planet found a new state of equilibrium, chaotic, dangerous, alien to life. And yet, humanity does not give up. We no longer ask why. We don't look for the guilty. We ask something else. Is it possible to return the moon? Is it possible to create an artificial satellite that will stabilize Earth again? This question becomes the goal of all humanity, the last hope to return the planet to its former appearance. When what seemed eternal disappears, we are too used to the moon. It just is. Every night, even if we don't see it, it hangs somewhere above the horizon, illuminates the oceans, holds Earth's hand like a caring older sister. It didn't demand attention, didn't ask for gratitude, just did its job. But our entire history rested on it. All civilizations, all peoples, all oceans, our entire climate. This is the result of the quiet, imperceptible presence of a celestial body that most don't even think about. And that is precisely why the loss of the moon would be so terrible. We would lose not a satellite. We would lose a part of Earth. Imagine a planet without rhythm, without landmarks, without that invisible metronome that set the beat for all living things for billions of years. Seas would start going crazy. Tides would become chaotic, like the breathing of a dying giant. The climate would jerk sideways, like an element broken off a leash. The rotation axis would float like a drunk spinning top. Impossible to predict where the next season will turn. But most importantly, stability would disappear. And without stability, there is no life. There are no civilizations. There is no future. And here comes the most important moment. All these billions of years, while we developed, learned, built cities, dreamed of stars, we thought we controlled our own destiny, that we are the pinnacle of evolution, masters of the planet, lords of nature. But in fact, all this time, the moon was guarding us, quietly, imperceptibly, without a word of gratitude. It kept Earth in stability so that we could develop, so that we had the opportunity to become who we became. And if you remove it, it turns out that we are much more fragile than we used to think. That our civilization rests not on technology, not on science, not on weapons, but on a tiny celestial satellite that was simply nearby. And then one question remains, from which shivers go down the spine. If such a small thing as the loss of the moon can destroy everything we know, then what else do we take for granted? What else do we not notice? What else seems eternal? Until one day it disappears. We look into space to understand. Our world hangs on invisible threads, and our task is to see them before they break. Because the true meaning of astronomy is not to look at the moon, but to learn to notice what saves us, even when we don't understand it.